Come public property, not only facilities have been improved, but rates have been reduced and revenues retained. In some cases, reduced rates have resulted in large increases of revenues, as in Hungary. It is sometimes said that this country will never consent to raise by taxation the enormous sum necessary to buy the railways. No taxes are needed. If the government can secure the money at 3%, railways pay 6% or more. The railways bought credit would pay for themselves in less than a generation. Much the same would be true of the other monopolies we have considered. Very often, too, it is urged that public enterprise of the sort is contrary to the traditions of our government, which it is asserted was founded on the principle of unmolested private enterprise. But why was it so founded? Simply because there were no monopolies, no collective and no non-competitive services where private ownership was dangerous and public ownership was a necessary safeguard. Enterprises such as then existed were naturally private. How were houses supplied with water and light? How were goods transported? And yet there was one collective service, the post office. Why was that not made private property? It is in harmony with the principles of our institutions that there is a rapid developing sentiment in favor of public ownership of those enterprises which from their nature cannot be subject to competition. These become more numerous and important and more dangerous in private hands as citizens advances. Public industry is in the monopolistic and private industry in the competitive field seems to be only feasible or natural law. Forestry. There are some of the other enterprises which for virtuous reason it is desirable the government should assume. In different countries, the state is furnishing insurance of various kinds, and that's successfully. Strong arguments based both upon the nature of the industry and actual experience can be adduced for the assumption of insurance by the state. The limited space of the present book will allow us, however, to discuss in this chapter only one of these other industries, and that one which has immediate practical importance. In the United States, namely forestry, all governments are taking upon themselves the ownership and management of forests, but the reasons of a different nature from these which lead to ownership and management of business which are monopolistic. New York State has acquired forests in the Adirondacks, and has entered upon forestry, having in her employee foresters. Bills have been brought before Congress which took to management of forests. As a permanent function of our national government, Switzerland, France, and Germany are increasing the area of governmental forests. The reasons are very obvious. When the conditions of successful forestry are examined, first of all, it may be said that rational forestry requires plans to be made for 120 years in advance. Trees must be planted to be felled at the expiration of that long period, for it takes the length of that time for them to grow to their full size, and when they are allowed to grow to the full size of the amount of timber needed can be grown on the smallest amount of land. Private individuals will not, however, invest money from which they expect to receive no return for over a century. Second, forests ought to be cultivated on a vast scale, on land especially adapted for forests. Land often good for nothing else in certain great regions, like steep mountain sides and sources of streams, ought to be entirely covered with forests. Their climatic influences are generally believed to be important, and forests with their leaves and undergrowth certainly prevent rainfall from rapidly rushing down mountainsides and deluging the country below. Forests prevent a waste of soil. It is said that where forests have been rashly removed from mountainsides in Baden, Germany, and in Switzerland, it will take 300 years to repair the damage. Soil must be slowly formed again. Private individuals will not select for forestry vast tracts of land property situated. In America, farmers have quite generally kept a few isolated acres in woodland, but this is not what is wanted. Very likely the land in kept trees is better adapted for something else, and forests may be needed. At this particular point, third, it requires highly trained scientific men to take care of a forest. It is necessary to go through high schools to follow a course for several years in forestry academy, and then to supplement this by apprenticeship of several years in practical work in forest. Only a state owning tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of acres can train and organize a properly qualified body of scientific foresters. The difference between a forest which grows up wild and one which is developed under a proper system of culture is so great that the trained eye can detect the difference nearly as far as sight can reach, and it is probably safe to say that it takes twice as much land to supply a given need when forests grow up themselves as where a rational system of forest culture obtains. Fourth, when forests are cultivated in large tracts, as they should be, covering up perhaps an entire mountain, very considerable quantities of game can be grown, and this forms an important element in the food of people. Our private system of forests in America results in almost total destruction of game in the settled parts of the country. Fifth, although forests do not pay private individuals the profits of Belgian forests, for example, not exceeding, it is said, 1 cent per on their selling value, they do pay the people as a whole on account of their general beneficial effects. More might be said on this topic were not space too limited. It is manifest from this petty measures which some of the states are introducing, like tax exemption for planting a few trees or covering a few acres with trees, will never accomplish anything of economic significance. Even, quote, arbor days are of little account save for their educational value. On that account, and on the account alone, unless it is be perhaps for the sake of another holiday, they should be encouraged. Summary: private monopolies are inherently objectionable and are intolerable in a free country. A business which controls a peculiarly desirable location which can increase its service without corresponding cost, and which supplies a service available only in the connection with its plant, is inherently a monopoly. Railways, gasworks, etc. have proved incapable of control by competition. Under private ownership, they cannot secure the maximum of safety, efficiency, or economy. Private enterprise, when it becomes monopolistic, ceases to be enterprising and cannot be made so by regulation. Public management of railways in some countries and of municipal monopolies in America's cities has proved more satisfactory in all respects. Why are private monopolies questionable? What is a monopoly? What conditions are necessary to constitute a monopoly? What industries especially present these conditions? What has been the result of private ownership in these industries as regards safety, efficiency, economy? What has been the result of public ownership in each case? Where has it been tried? What is the necessary condition of enterprise under private ownership? What is the proper field of private enterprise, of public enterprise? What special reasons exist for government forestry? Relation of the state to industrial action literature. Socialism. The elements of socialism, those who desire industrial democracy not prematurely, but in its own time, are many, and they include perhaps most of the best economists. There are, however, different ways by which it is proposed to attain the desired goal. One of these ways is voluntarily cooperation for all competitive pursuits and governmental activity for monopolistic undertakings. Another one of these ways is called socialism. Socialism means coercive cooperation not merely for undertakings of a monopolistic nature, but for all productive enterprises. Socialists seek the establishment of industrial democracy through the instrumentality of the state, which they hold to be not the only way whereby it can be attained. Socialism contemplates an expansion of the business functions of government until all businesses is absorbed. All business is then to be regulated by the people in their organic capacity, each man and each woman having the rights with which any other man or other woman has. Our political organization is to become an economic industrial organization. Private property is profit-producing capital and rent-producing land. It is to be abolished, and private property and income is to be retained, but with this restriction that it shall not be employed in productive enterprises that is desired. Then it is not, as is supposed, by uniformed a division of property, but a concentration of property. The socialists do not complain because productive property is too much concentrated, but because it is sufficiently so. There are four elements in socialism, namely the first of common ownership of means production, second the common management of these means of production, third the distribution of annual products of industry by common authority, fourth private property in the greater portion of income. Socialists make no war on capital, strictly speaking. What socialists object to is private capitalists. They desire to nationalize capital and to abolish capitalists as a distinct class by making everybody as a member of the community a capitalist, that is, a partial owner of the capital in the country. Socialists say that labor creates all wealth. No rational socialist means thereby to deny that land and capital are factors of production, but as they are passive factors, they hold that their owners ought not to receive a share of the product unless they personally are useful members of the community. Labor is the active force, factor, and all production is carried on for the sake of man. Land and labor are simply the tools of man. Socialists admit that the owners of these tools must receive a return for them when industry is organized as it is now. Hence, they desire these tools should become common property. They wish to make of universal application the command of the Apostle Paul, quote, "If a man will not work, neither let him eat." Distributive justice. The central aim of socialism, the pivotal point, is distributive justice. It proposes to distribute products justly. The ideas of socialists are, however, not harmonious as to what constitutes justice. Some say quality is justice, others distribution in proportion to real needs, so that each may have the economic means for his completest development. Still others say justice means distribution in proportion to merit or service rendered, but the service of the individual, not of his ancestors' bequest and inheritance, except of articles of enjoyment like pictures, old family plate, books, household furnitures, possibly also the use of a house as a home, must be abolished. Socialism allows no inheritance, which renders labor needless. Socialism, an extension of existing institutions. Our government owns the post office. Most governments own the telegraph. Nearly all own the wagon roads. Some own the canals and railways. Many governments own factories. Probably every national government does at least a little manufacturing. Most governments cultivate forests, and some cultivate more or less arable land. We have only to imagine an extension of what already exists. Until government cultivates all land, manufactures all goods, conducts all exchanges, and carries on, in short, every productive enterprise, and we have socialism pure and simple. At the present time, we have private property in nearly all the income of society, or the national dividend, and it is called. But some things are used in common, and afford what may be called a common income. Public parks, public schools, public galleries, and the like are of this character. Private property and income would continue under socialism, and there would be provision of private property for everyone, so that in this respect socialism emphasizes and extends the idea of private property. On the other hand, socialism would naturally continue and intensify the tendency to enjoy things in the common. This is what is meant by saying that socialism signifies private property in the greater portion, but not all of income. The strength of socialism. Socialism makes perhaps its strongest claim in its plea, first, for scientific organization of the productive forces of society, and second, for a just distribution of annual social income. It is said that the present production of economic goods is in small proportion to population, but socialism replies, quote, "Naturally enough, competition is wasteful. 2 railways are built where 1 would suffice. 2 trains run parallel between 2 cities, where 1 would serve the public equally well. 3 times as many milk wagons, horses, and drivers are required to serve the people with milk as would suffice if the milk business were organized like the mail distribution business in cities. Look at the shops, wholesale and retail, and see the waste of human force. Without competition, the whole dry goods and grocery business would be carried on with a third of the present economic expenditure of force. Reflect on all the idle classes in modern society. Socialism would set everybody to work, and making each one dependent on his own exertions for success would stimulate all energies. The argument is continued after that fashion, and it is a telling one. It does not prove the point unless we grant 2 things. First, that the present waste and idleness cannot be suppressed or greatly diminished without a departure from the fundamental principles of our present industrial order. Second, that socialism is practicable. Justice is a strong plea in the program of socialism, and it cannot be for one moment claimed that each one's income is at a present proportion to his services to humanity. Income in proportion is to industrial merit is too attractive to an ethical statement. But can we not approximate more nearly to that than at by social reform. And by social reform is meant the improvement of existing institutions, but not their abandonment. No doubt the idle man is more morally a thief. He receives, but gives nothing in return. Any man who by past services of his own has not earned the right of response in the shameless cumberer of the earth, unless indeed he is physically or mentally incapacitated for useful employment. Would the world suffer if you should die? That is the test. If you merely clip coupons, then no one would miss you. Others would willingly relieve you. But your service need not to be manual toil. Dr. James Fraser, the late Bishop of Manchester, England, recognized the obligations of personal service, but he did not in consequence favor socialism. He argued in The Wise, most of us are by our necessities obliged to render services to our fellows. Some of us, however, have inherited or received money in the way without a return on our part. We are placed by God on our honor. It is now a matter not of physical compulsion, but of honor with us to serve our fellows. What is here said would apply, of course, not merely. These are not Bishop's exact words. It has been many years since the author has read them, but he has responded to the idea. Of course, not merely to those who receive wealth by inheritance, but to those who become wealthy by the discovery of valuable treasures, like oil, natural gas, gold, minerals, etc., on or under soil which they own, or by the mere growth of cities, which adds immensely to the value of land. Legally the wealth is mine, but morally it is simply new opportunity for me to help forward the progress of humanity. For ethically I myself am not my own. Social reform. We may likewise inquire whether without a departure from the institution of private property, the laws of bequest and inheritance may not be so changed as to bring about fairer distribution of products, whether also by public ownership and management of natural monopolies much of the waste of present private competition may not be avoided. These are and multitude of other questions suggest themselves. Social reform seems likely to accomplish more valuable results than socialism. What is needed in a free and peaceful evolution of industrial institutions, but not a radical departure from fundamental institutions. The weakness of socialism. It does not appear clear to the author how socialism could be made to work in actual life. The danger to freedom seems a very real one. It is frankly admitted that up to a certain point there is a tendency of part of government to improve as its functions increase. But wouldn't this hold the indefinite extension of the sphere of government? Let us admit that as our livelihood would depend on efficiency of government, all the force and energy which now go into private service would be turned into public channels. But what would happen if, in spite of all the precautions, some unscrupulous combination should secure the control of government? There would be no standing ground for effective opposition outside of government, for dismissal from the service of government would mean a cessation of opportunity to gain of livelihood. If all production is carried on by public authority, there could be let no private press for criticism, and it is to be feared that unwelcome viewers, which after all may be true ones, would fare much worse than at present. The domination of a single industrial principle is also dangerous to civilization. It has been held that the domination of a single social principle has led to the downfall of older civilizations, and a distinguished American has expressed the fear that private business principle, with that naturally goes with it, called by the scholar mercantilism, threatens American civilization. Now what is wanted by coordination of two principles, the principle of public business and that the private business is desirable, that some should serve the public in an official capacity. Some are adapted for that. It is desirable that the ample field should be left for those who prefer private innovation and activity. Thus only will our civilization be rendered rich and full. Character of socialists. Socialism has rendered good service by calling attention to social problems, by forcing us to reflect on the condition of the less fortunate classes, by quickening our consciences, also by helping us to form the habit acquired by few as yet of looking at all questions from the standpoint of the public welfare and not merely of the individual gain. Finally, by calling our attention to the nature of the industrial function of government, helping us separate rationality, rationally the private industrial sphere from the public industrial sphere, socialism as a theory of society cannot, of course, be regarded as in any sense morally blameworthy. It has also been advocated by good men and by bad men also. Today it numbers earnest Christians and sincere ministers of the gospel among its adherents. As there are good Republicans and bad Republicans, there are good socialists and bad socialists. If every time a Republican was guilty of criminal act, all the newspapers said that it is what comes of being a Republican, we might begin to think all Republicans bad men. It is a mistake to suppose that socialists belong to the criminal classes. Those who have worked. Hahn A.D., white ex-president of the Cornell University, is an excellent address entitled The Message of the 19th Century to the 20th. Those who have worked among the criminal classes are carefully studied. Them will not tell us almost no socialists are found among them. At the same time, it must be said that the socialists have been most unfortunate in a large proportion of their public representatives, especially of their noisiest representatives, who have secured the largest amount of attention. Some of them have been vicious men, and many of them have been bitter and vindictive. Needlessly, animosity has been aroused, and class hatred nourished. The cause of progress has thus been seriously injured. Furthermore, a number of questions having no connection with socialism have been, even by socialists, not infrequently associated with it. Indefinitely and free love may be mentioned. Of course, these have nothing to do with socialism. Socialism has done harm on account of the manner in which it had been too frequently presented, and it has also accomplished good, but the best effects of socialism have been its indirect and not its direct consequences. Anarchism. In contrast with the socialist, there are those who hold that if all government were abolished, men would freely and spontaneously form cooperative groups which, federated, would manage all production. These men attack government and deny the moral right of man through government to exercise authority over his fellows. These are anarchists, sometimes called anarchist socialists. The writer frankly confesses his inability even to imagine how this kind of socialism would be made to work in actual life. Communism is an older term not often used. It has been employed in the past to designate an extreme kind of socialism. Some writers have called violent schemes of radical social reform communistic, and reserved the term socialist for the more conservative plans of reconstruction. All the existing communistic societies in the United States are, however, composed of peacemen who do not believe in the war but in non-resistance. It is perhaps as well to abandon the attempt to make distinction between communism and socialism, and to drop the word communism. Collectivism is often used as a synonym for socialism, particularly in France. Socialism is coercive cooperation in all industrial enterprises. Socialists admit private property and income, but it is not means of production. Socialists claim that labor produces all wealth, and they aim at a distribution based on justice. Socialism is but an extension of existing institutions. The strength of socialism lies in proposed saving of waste and its juster distribution. Its weakness lies in almost impossible requirements of virtue and the absolute dependence of all upon this. Anarchism is the opposite of socialism, a belief in the needlessness of government. Communism is a vague and nearly obsolete synonym for socialism. Define socialism, communism, anarchism. What is the attitude of socialism toward private property? What effect would successful socialism have on production, on distribution? What difficulties are in the way of attachment of the socialistic ideal? What is the character of socialists? What socialistic features now exist in our government? Do they increase or diminish? What is the origin of wealth according to socialists? Are they correct? Why is anarchism unfeasible? Literature. Looking backward, capital, cooperative, commonwealth, the quintessence of socialism. Socialism of today, contemporary socialism, studies in modern socialism and the labor problem, inquiry into socialism, French and German socialism, labor movement in America. Public expenditure. Introductory. In part 1, we considered the relation of the state to be productive activities of society. We now come to a part of the work which is usually called public finance. By public finance, we understand that part of the economics which deals with the acquisition of public revenues, their management, and their expenditure. The remainder of the present book deals with what we may, in a broad sense, call public finance, although other than purely financial considerations into our treatment, investment and expenditure. As a result of what has gone before, we have reached the conclusion that as a rule, private enterprise should manage the various competitive industries, that the industries not subject to competition are best managed by the state. In the management of enterprises, the state will necessarily invest immense amounts of capital, but as these transactions do not come under the head of public expenditure as the term is here used, when we lend money we do not call it spent, nor yet when we use it to buy productive property. Such uses are investments, not expenditures. By an investment we mean outlay of capital which returns a direct income equal to current interest. An expenditure is an outlay which yields an indirect income only, or is for the purpose of satisfying wants directly. Any public enterprise may be managed either as investment or as an expenditure. If the service is rendered sold to the individual consumer at the price which covers cost and affords a reasonable profit, it is an investment. If the service is furnished free and the expense paid by taxation other than revenue, it is an expenditure. Still, a third method is combined the two, furnishing the service not free, but at less than cost. State railways and municipal lighting plants are examples of investments. The public roads are examples of expenditure. Expenditure. The post office is a combination of both. We do not here include the entire outlay of the postal service under expenditures, but only the deficit which is annually covered by an appropriation. On the other hand, if a public investment yields a surplus, it is classed as revenue. Whether an enterprise should be managed by an investment or an expenditure of both is purely a question of its nature and the result to the general welfare. It is something which men need to be encouraged to use. It should be made cheap without regard to cost. If it is something to use of which needs restraint, it should be made dear equally without regard to cost. For example, it would be possible to charge an admission fee for entrance to public parks, but such an effort to make parks pay for their maintenance would simply keep people out of them, and especially those who most used to frequent them. Here is the case where people need to be encouraged to use public service and consequently no charge is made for it. The Postal Service is another case when encouragement is needed and restraint as well. Ease of communication is highly important, but no one can doubt that if no charge were made, the mails would be unprofitably used and waste incurred. Our own government has thought best to put the charge low without removing it and meet a small part of the outlay by expenditure. Water is a similar case. It needs encouragement, but to furnish it free would result in wasteful use. A small charge usually makes people more saving. Municipal lighting is usually made to pay the cost and often a considerable revenue. The same is true of streetcars. As an extreme example of investment principle may be mentioned, state monopolies of intoxicating liquors and tobacco. Where such monopolies exist, prices are put far above cost, as the use of these articles requires strong disencouragement. In every industry, a point will be found where the service will confer a maximum benefit upon society, and here the price should be fixed no matter what the cost. Roads, labors, lighthouses, schools cost much money, but it is very generally held that they should be free. It costs a little to carry a letter, but everyone believes that the sender should pay something for it, increase of public expenditure. There is a distinct tendency in highly civilized societies to increase public expenditure. The expenditures in England increased 46 times between 1685 and 1841, while the population only trebled. The French budget in 1828 reached the sum of 1,000 million francs, and people were alarmed. Since then it was past 3,000 millions, and including local expenditure, 4,000 millions. The state taxes of Ohio increased 46 times in 60 years, the local taxes over 100 times. The expenditures of the federal government are shown in the following table. Years 1828 through 1892, from civil establishment 3,676,000, 100,000, 53, 99 million in 1892, 841, 100,000, 987, Total expenditures less interest on debt, 13,296,100,041. 92, 321,645,214. 1892, ordinarily total expenditure including interest but not bond purchases, 345,023,331. In 1828, 16,394,842. The first impression one receives from such facts is one alarm, and there are many people who see in this sign of a demoralization, but we must examine carefully these facts before we reach a conclusion as to their meaning. Increased expenditure on the part of government may mean either increased costliness or service of increased amount of service. The prejudice against government expenditures arises from a confusion of two things. If the state does no more for us than formerly, and yet spends more of our wealth in doing it, then indeed there is reason for complaint and alarm, as there is also expenditures exceed capacity and bankruptcy or repudiation threatens us. But if government doubles its expenditures and at the same time trebles its service to us, we have reason for satisfaction. It is not possible for us to enter into an exhaustive examination of this question, but there is an abundant evidence that the service of government has been improved in extent and in quality enormously during this period. It increased outlay. Compare our postal service or educational system with that of 50 or 100 years ago. When was ever a letter carried so far, so quickly, or so cheaply now? When we have equal educational advantages ever been had at so low a price as now? Public and private expenditure. We must not forget that wealth is to be consumed with a view to the satisfaction of human wants. An increase of expenditure is a good thing if the increase is wisely spent. This brings us to the question which is vital to our whole subject. Do we get more from the public or from private expenditure? On this point we have long been in the habit of feeling rather than thinking. We dislike to pay taxes. The things which taxes buy we do not carry home in our pockets or have are all to ourselves. As we feel that if taxes were so much pure loss, of course we know better, but we act as if we did not. It behooves us to think very carefully on this point, for some of the most momentous problems of our day are here involved. Let us notice the principal differences between public and private expenditure. Public expenditure is inclusive, private expenditure exclusive. A private citizen buys a beautiful painting for $10,000 and puts it in his house, where he had a few friends can see it. Perhaps 1,000 people see it in a year. The same picture in public gallery is seen by all who wish, say 100,000 persons per year. Where does it go? Where does it do the most good? Or look at it from another standpoint. Suppose interest, insurance, etc. amount to 10%. It costs the owner $1,000 to keep a picture, or $1 for each person who sees it, while in the public gallery the expense is 1 cent each. The wealthy owner who pays $10,000 for the picture could see it as often as he liked in the public gallery. By paying a single extra dollar